Hello and welcome to a new episode of In Conversation With, where we invite some of our fantastic policy experts to talk about all sorts of economic matters from across the European Union. My name is Bartha. I'm the director of Epicenter, a network of 12 leading free market think tanks from all across Europe. And today I've got the pleasure to welcome Carl-Vincent Reimers, who is the program manager of European Affairs at Timbro, to talk about his recent publication, Draghi's Dilemma. And Carl-Vincent, we both know that Europe is now unfortunately falling behind in so many different areas, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's energy production, whether it's AI. Draghi really pointed out already 1.5 years ago that Europe is facing really a competitiveness dilemma. So how do you approach this problem? What do you think the crux of the issue is, and what can we do to fix it?
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Just to start with, what Draghi means with dilemma is the fact that, Europe has had very high economic ambitions, we've had very high environmental ambitions, and we've had historically also very high social ambitions. And basically what Draghi says in his report, the general conclusion of his report, is that we can't have these ambitions at the same time if we don't address the competitiveness problem here that Europe has in long term. In other words, if we continue to decline in terms of competitiveness, we will have to compromise in terms of our social standards or our environmental and climate ambitions. Should we lower emissions or should we lower production? Should we lower our social standards or should we lower our ability to compete with China and the US? So this is the pure dilemma that he's talking about. And if we're looking more into the solution part, what Draghi address with this is a very bold agenda that address both the economic productivity part of competitiveness, but essentially also he's putting forward an agenda to address the more geopolitical perspectives on this. And this is, I find, a very tricky part if you're a market liberal, like both you and me are, and some of our listeners, I believe, that it is hard to be a market liberal and try to address both the productivity part and the geopolitical competition. And this is what I aim to do in this report. It's a way of trying to address this trade-off. What reforms can we actually put forward that make sense both from, let's say, a market liberal point of view and from the perspective of the increasing geopolitical competition between the great powers. So this is basically what I'm trying to do in this report.
But surely the two are interlinked. So if we improve economically, then obviously our space for geopolitical actions are also going to increase. So
Definitely.
Just sticking to the economic angle for a moment,
Yeah.
What are kind of if you had to change the top 3 things about the EU's regulatory framework that would help economic competitiveness on the old continent, what would those be?
Yeah. I would say the most key, the most pressing issue to actually address is the overregulation part. And I think essentially there are 2 parts within this frame we can call overregulation. First, I would say that the EU is itself producing too many rules. We've seen this before. The numbers that the EU is producing too many rules compared to the US is today well known.
So what are these differences? So how many rules does the EU create? Let's say in the last 5 years during the last term, and how much did the US?
Yeah, so there is this number comparing, I think if I remember correctly, EU has produced in total 13,000 legislative acts, including both laws and acts, whereas the US has produced around 5,000. So it's
almost 3 times as much. Right?
Almost 3 times as much. It's an absurd number if you look at it in this comparative way. And I think the reason for this is that the European Commission has functioned according to this, what we call the neo-functionalist logic, that regulation is itself driving more regulation, and that there is let's say an intrinsic good in that regulation is pushing forward. I think this is the sort of the culture within the Commission that needs to stop. Just to mention also the second part of it, I think there's partly these that the EU producing too many rules itself, but it's also the national fragmentation in rules. If we look on, for example, the single market, we see an extreme fragmentation. And I would say that this is very much at odds with the ambition when we created the single market from the beginning in the 1980s. The ambition was to have a single rule book for the whole single market. We can see that we have achieved that in some areas, for example in the trade of goods, but we have not achieved it in other crucial areas, like in the digital sector, or for example when it comes to the business law, the business codes across Europe. And so there are two different parts here, I would say, that is part of the overregulation.
So let's stick to the first part a little bit, the number of regulations.
Yeah.
Almost a year ago, the European Commission came up with the competitiveness compass because they kind of realized that the EU is really lagging behind in economic growth and innovation. And as a result, it launched the regulatory simplification agenda, which is now in progress. Some people are happy about it, others aren't. But in your view, is the current regulatory simplification agenda enough to address some of these underlying problems, or would you like to see the EU go further?
So I wouldn't say that it's enough, but I would say that the Commission is definitely now moving in the right direction. I think here we have to view a bit like the Commission like an oil tanker. And if you're an oil tanker and you move in a specific direction, it takes time to slower the speed and actually reverse. And even if the engine started to go backwards, it still will, the tanker will still continue forward. And I think that's what we see at the moment. We see a completely different mindset in the political agenda, in the political leadership. But I think that there is still this backlog of regulation that has built up for years and years and years. And we can see that that will come out even more with new acts. So yes, I think there is some time before we actually see the deregulation taking place. I think as well here that we should not underestimate the importance of the different political majority in the European Parliament. I think this is crucial if we look on the long-term political agenda. I think just a couple of weeks ago we saw this when the ECR decided to vote with the EPP on this omnibus package that the Commission put forward. I think that shows that when there is this different political majority, there is actually a lot we can go forward with in terms of deregulation and simplification.
And you mentioned the omnibus packages, and one of them is specifically addressing technology and digital regulation. And Dragi's report already outlined one of the key drivers between the faster productivity growth in the US and the slower productivity growth in the EU is technology. Yes. Essentially, that is the crux of the issue. So when it comes to the digital omnibus itself, how do you see it developing over the next year? Is it going to be really this wide-ranging regulatory simplification that's going to be able to kickstart economic growth in Europe? Or do we need to consider a lot of other segments like the lack of the capital markets and labor market laws, and how intertwined are these problems? Can we really say if the digital omnibus is going to pass and it's going to be a good one, can we actually feel a tangible difference? Or do a billion other things need to be done in order to have that tangible economic growth?
Honestly, I'm going to make a simple answer here. I think we need to do both, actually. I think the omnibus packages are important, but I think we should view the omnibus package more as, not pushing on the brake anymore, but not as much as giving gas to the engine. And I think we need other bold reforms to be put forward in the coming years if we actually want, for example, if we look on the innovation system. I mean, you were mentioning it briefly before that the tech sector is really the crucial part here, why Europe is falling behind in productivity. And if we compare, for example, with the US, we see no large-scale innovation cluster in Europe. So why is that? I think a large part of it comes from what you were mentioning, the lack of common capital markets. We still have a huge fragmentation in terms of where the capital is allocated in Europe. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because if we look on these technologies you were mentioning in the introduction here, AI, quantum, and so on, these are technologies that require massive capital concentration. And we can't see that any European country right now is able to achieve that. So I think here the importance of a common market for capital is important to be able companies to scale. and being able to create this innovation system that allows scale to happen. I actually think here as well that the European Commission actually right now is hindering that. I mean, for good motives, but just take the example of competition law, which we've had in the European Union for decades. These competition laws were formed based on the assumption of the importance of having a very high competition within European countries. What we see now is a different kind of competition, and what's happening then is, in fact, that the European Commission is actually hindering consolidation on the market, which is also important for innovation. We have been very focused on the competition part and the fragmentation part, but we see now that actually some of these competition rules can hinder organic consolidation on the market. So I think we need to reform the competition law rule book as well, which is something also Draghi puts forward. I think here what we see is the deadlock in the Council. That's where the problem is. I think the Commission actually understands this problem, but I think we need to see more bold action also in the Council to address these issues.
But you actually do have some positive examples across Europe when it comes to properly functioning capital markets. Your home country, Sweden, is actually one of them. It's one of the good examples. So what do you think other countries can copy, both on a national level from Sweden to improve their own markets, but also on a European level, pan-European level, what reforms are needed to unlock these potentials across the whole Union?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's very flattering as a Swede to see that Draghi puts forward Sweden as an example here in capital markets. And definitely, I think there are things here we can learn from Sweden. I mean, of course, not copy a single national model is of course not viable. But I think definitely, if you look on certain products in terms of saving, we can learn a lot. Just to mention a few examples, Sweden has had for decades a very deep capital markets. What do I mean by deep? Well, I mean a high popular participation in the capital markets. So let's say the capital
pensions, or what are we talking about?
Pension funds, for example, that actually invest in innovative entrepreneurs on the stock market, and not just putting money in savings account. This is crucial, I think. I think that you see a high popular participation in this is also increasing the legitimacy of the capital markets. The capital markets doesn't have to be an elite, engagement, and this I think is very important, something you see in Sweden. I would also like to mention what we call the investment savings accounts in Sweden, which was a very simplified form of a savings account with barely no tax or reporting obligations for individuals. I have one myself. It's one of the best products I think you can use in terms of investing in the stock market if you're basically an amateur. But what this does is that it's actually enabling the capital that exists in so many European or Swedish savings account and make it accessible for the innovative ideas. That, I think, is a large reason why we've seen a very viable Swedish tech scene with startups, with like now AI startup Lovable. We've seen Spotify before, we've seen many of these companies coming up. So I think I also think that the IMF put out a figure there showing that we could actually mobilize, I think it's 800 billion euros if we actually just save the way the Americans do, in bonds and on the stock market. So this is a huge number.
And a lot of it comes down to pensions reforms, right?
Yes.
So if you move away from the pay-as-you-go pension systems that are more prevalent across Europe to a capitalized pension system, then you're going to unlock a lot of these savings that can actually be invested across the European economy.
Completely. And I agree with you that there's a lot here that the individual countries can do. I think the crucial question here is is that a realistic path to be taken? I think here you can come up with different, different solutions from a market liberal standpoint. Either you can say, like Draghi, we need actually a common European capital regulation authority that is actually taking over this responsibility of the national regulation authorities.
Do we?
I think we do. I think this is the only actually viable way to modernize the capital markets, especially in more southern European countries. And when I say it's the only viable path, I'm meaning that realistically, politically in these countries, I think that it's in Brussels we actually see this willingness to modernize in a way, and among a lot of not only the bureaucrats, let's say, but actually from the national politicians of these countries. So I think it's possible, but I also think that you can do a lot on your own in your home country to approve this.
And I want to return to your point that we talked a little bit about, the kind of fragmentation across the 27 European Union member states. So one current legislative proposal to fix that is the 28th regime, which would create a voluntary layer of corporate rules and regulations that startups and mostly tech-oriented companies could use. Do you think that's a viable way of creating this kind of pan-European competition and bypassing the national fragmentation? Or really is it the more harmonized approach that we would need instead?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think that the 28th regime, I mean, just to explain briefly what it means, is that it's what Draghi proposed with 28th regime is to create a simplified rule book for like a common European business code in a simplified form. I think if you do this in a purely simplified form, this could actually work. And I think also the voluntary element here is very important, that this is not at odds with, let's say, the national regulation. It will still be possible for all the European countries to have your own business code regulation. So this is a way of sort of bypassing the need to reach consensus on all of these issues, because I mean, in the end we have different national cultures when it comes to the business code. I mean, for example, comparing the rule book for a Swedish business code with a French business code is completely different worlds, and I don't think there is a short-term solution to address this now, but it is possible to create a simplified European, pan-European rule book for this. But I think then we also have to learn about the mistakes. Around 20 years ago, we created the SE, the European company form. I think there are barely 5 European companies existing according to this rulebook today, because it was so complicated. So I think we really need to learn from those mistakes, make this rulebook a simplified version, and then it could be actually viable. And create a better integration as well, of course, on the market. Because in the end, if we look what European companies themselves says is hindering the integration on the market, the business code is a crucial part. We've seen this in a lot of surveys around the European Union.
So let's imagine we are back here in Brussels in a year's time in 2027. Yeah. A lot of the omnibus discussions have happened, some of them have passed. Some of the recommendations in your report and Draghi's report have been implemented. What is your hope, if you have to outline the top 3 most important things that you would like to see implemented and you think are realistically implemented within the next 12 months? What would those be?
So I would say, I mean, the first most important thing I think to push forward with strategically is the 28th regime, as we just talked about. I think this is very important. I mean, we spoke about deregulation. That's sort of the baseline. That's something we need to do. But if I think more strategically in the future, the 28th regime is really important to get that right. Secondly, I would say reform the competition rules, allow the formation of, let's say, European champions, not state-subsidized champions. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about real champions formed on the free market. That's something we need. Thirdly, I would say starting to form the single capital market. I don't know if this should be done via a federal agency or with using more, let's say, harmonizing the rules of the national regulatory authorities on the capital market. But we need to form a single capital market to be able to compete with the United States. So those would be my 3 most important reforms.
Well, we're going to hold ourselves accountable and the policymakers accountable and be back here in 12 months to reassess how Draghi's recommendations are going. But for now, really, thank you so much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
I hope you have enjoyed it too. Do let us know your thoughts in the comments, whether you think that the EU is on the right regulatory simplification path or whether you think it should go much further. But for now, thank you so much for the conversation and for viewing the conversation. Don't forget to sign up to all the Epicenter social media channels, and we will be back soon with a new In Conversation With episode. Thank you and see you soon.